it into it wouldn't. All the libraries of all the world wouldn't be able to contain the books that came from it, which is kind of like an interesting, because a lot of people that hear, "Oh, it's not in the Bible; it didn't happen." But and he's telling you right there, a lot of stuff happened, and we didn't write it down. I mean, the Gospels are synoptic.
Millions of people heard it. They just did not know what they were hearing. It was a Tuesday night. Joe Rogan's podcast was running. Mel Gibson was sitting across from him, calm, direct, and saying things most Hollywood conversations never go near. He was not talking about box office numbers. He was not talking about awards. He was talking about resurrection, about fallen angels, about a spiritual world so layered, so ancient, so violent at its roots, that the story most believers think they know suddenly felt like a single page torn from a book that is thousands of pages long. The clip spread fast. Millions watched it. Most people filed it under interesting and moved on. But a smaller group of people, the ones who already felt something was missing, the ones who had already started asking questions their churches could not fully answer, those people sat very still. Their hands went quiet on their phones. Something in what Gibson described matched a discomfort they had been carrying for years and could never name. He was describing a resurrection story that did not begin at the tomb. It reached further back, into darkness, into a war that started long before Calvary. That moment did something. It cracked open a question that millions of believers had been trained, not always intentionally, to leave unasked. The question was not whether the resurrection happened. The question was what kind of world the resurrection happened inside of. And when that question opens, it does not close easily. Hi viewers, here is a question for the comments right now. When you first heard about the Book of Enoch, the Ethiopian Bible, or the Nephilim, did someone in your church or family ever explain it to you, or did you have to find it on your own? Drop your answer below, because the answer to that question matters more than most people realize. Because here is what the history actually shows. The world Mel Gibson was circling on that podcast, the world of fallen watchers, cosmic conflict, judgment, and spiritual warfare, was not invented by Hollywood. It was not invented by the internet. It was preserved in stone, in manuscript, in ancient Christian tradition, in the canon of the oldest continuously practicing Christian church on earth. And the most important part is not that it was preserved. The most important part is what it says about the warnings Jesus Christ gave to the people who would come after him. That is where this story begins, and that is also where it gets uncomfortable.
The resurrection.
That's it.
So like where are we at on finishing the story?
Yeah, well, you gotta, of course, that's been working its way out too, and that took longer because that's a bigger story.
It is. I mean, we talked about it here in this office last time. It's like it all.
Mel Gibson did not walk into that podcast studio carrying a theology degree. He walked in as a filmmaker, a man who had already done the unthinkable once before, who had taken the most sacred story in Christian history and put it on a screen so raw, so physical, so unflinching in its violence that audiences wept openly in movie theaters around the world in 2004. That film was The Passion of the Christ. It earned over $600 million worldwide. It remains one of the highest-grossing independent films ever made. But Gibson was not finished with the story. Reports from his conversation with Rogan confirmed what his production team had already been signaling for years. The sequel, titled The Resurrection of the Christ, was being developed not as a simple follow-up, but as something far more ambitious. Gibson described a scope that would stretch from the fall of angels to the death of the last apostle. More recent reporting indicates the project is now being structured as a two-part film. The resurrection was never only the ending. It was the turning point inside a war that had been running since before human memory. That framing stopped certain listeners completely, because serious students of the Bible already knew what that scope implied. A story that reaches from the fall of angels backward and from the last apostle forward is not a simple Easter narrative. It is a cosmic framework. It includes the beings described in Genesis 6. It includes the judgment that preceded the flood. It includes the question that Western Christianity has largely left in the margins for 17 centuries, which is what exactly were the forces that Jesus came to defeat, and where did those forces come from? Gibson, whether he intended it or not, had just pointed a global audience directly at one of the most suppressed and most documented tensions in the entire biblical record. He pointed them toward the ancient world that Jesus grew up inside of, a world where apocalyptic expectation was not fringe theology, it was daily breath, a world where the Book of Enoch was not a curiosity, it was studied, copied, preserved, and in one part of the ancient Christian world, it was never removed from the Bible at all. That part of the world is Ethiopia. And what the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved inside its biblical tradition is not a footnote. It is a warning, one that Jesus himself referenced, and one that most modern believers were never fully
Resurrection is the
shown.
one that is the most difficult for people to swallow.
Yes.
That's the one that requires the most faith.
The most faith and the most belief. Yeah, resurrection.
Yeah.
Who gets back up 3 days later after he gets murdered in public? Who gets back up under his own power?
High in the mountains of northern Ethiopia, carved into cliffs that most of the Western world has never stood beside, there are monasteries that have been copying scripture without interruption for over 15 centuries. The monks who work inside those walls are not performing a cultural ritual. They are continuing a chain of preservation that began before the Catholic Church finalized its own canon, before the Council of Trent, before the Protestant Reformation, before the King James Bible existed. These men were already copying texts that the Western Church had moved on from, restricted, or quietly set aside. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is not a splinter group. It is not a modern movement. It is one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth, with roots stretching back to the 4th century, when Christianity reached the kingdom of Aksum long before it reached most of Western Europe. Its own canonical page lists the texts it preserves, and that list does not look like any Bible most American believers have ever held. The Ethiopian Bible contains up to 88 books. The Protestant Bible contains 66. The Catholic version contains 73. That is not a rounding error. That is entire scriptures, entire ancient traditions, entire records of how early followers of God understood the spiritual world they were living inside of. The difference between 66 books and 88 books is not a debate about translation. It is a question about what information was preserved, what information was removed, and who made those decisions and when. Among the texts that the Ethiopian tradition preserves is the Book of Enoch, not as a curiosity sitting in a dusty archive somewhere, as part of the canon, as scripture, as a document that Ethiopian Christians have read, studied, prayed over, and copied for more than 1,000 years. Enoch is described in Britannica as an apocalyptic work connected to themes of fallen angels, judgment, and cosmic revelation. It is attributed in the ancient tradition to the biblical figure Enoch, who appears in Genesis 5:24, where the text records something it says about almost no one else, that Enoch walked with God and then was not, because God took him. That single verse in Genesis opens a door. Behind it stands one of the oldest and most disturbing spiritual records in human history, a record of a world that deteriorated so completely, so systematically, and so quietly that by the time judgment arrived, most of the people living through it did not see it coming. And the reason that matters to every person watching this today is not because it is ancient history. It is because of what Jesus said about that world. He did not use it as a lesson from the past. He used it as a mirror for what would come. Open Genesis 6, read it slowly. Read it the way a first-century Jewish reader would have read it, with the full weight of every word, with the understanding that Hebrew scripture does not waste language, that every name, every number, every phrase carries a load of meaning that English translations sometimes flatten without warning. Genesis 6:1 records that when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, daughters were born to them. Genesis 6:2 records that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took them as wives, choosing whoever they wanted. Genesis 6:4 records a word that has unsettled scholars, translators, and theologians for centuries. The word is Nephilim. The text states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men and had children by them. It calls those children mighty men, men of renown. The Hebrew word Nephilim comes from the root naphal, meaning to fall. That root is not accidental. Ancient readers did not read it as accidental either. Genesis 6:5 then records what this produced. The text states that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every intent, only evil, continually. This is not a description of general moral decline. This is a description of total corruption.
I mean, God becomes man and rises from the dead. Never going to be a snoozer.
No. Okay. But it's predictable in that, okay, now we know what happens, and this happens, and this happens, and this happens, but what are the other things around it that happen?
Who's the bad guy? Is it Thomas, who doubts that Christ is risen?
No.
No? No bad guys?
Well, there are.
Yeah?
A civilization so far from its original design that its interior world, the place where thought and will and conscience live, had been completely overtaken. Most people reading a modern Bible receive those 7 verses and move on to Noah. But a first-century reader would not have moved on. A first-century reader, especially one living in the world that Jesus was born into, would have connected Genesis 6 to a much larger body of ancient reflection on what happened before the flood. They would have known the tradition that describes the Watchers, the angels who, according to the Book of Enoch chapters 6 through 16, descended, made agreements with human women, and began teaching humanity things it was not meant to know yet. Metalworking, enchantments, the art of war, knowledge that accelerated human capability while tearing apart human wisdom. The result, according to that ancient understanding, was not just sin. It was a contamination that ran so deep, moved so quietly, and spread so completely that the world began to look normal again. People ate, people married, people built, people conducted the daily business of being alive, and underneath all of it, something catastrophic was unfolding that almost no one was paying attention to. That is the world the flood ended. That is the world Jesus pointed back to in Matthew 24. Not as a horror story from long ago, as a description of conditions that would return. And here is where the story changes completely, because the ancient texts that preserved this understanding did not disappear. They survived, and scholars have held the physical evidence in their hands. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Ed-Dihib was searching for a lost goat near the cliffs of Qumran on the northwestern edge of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave opening to see if his animal had wandered inside. He heard pottery breaking. He climbed in to investigate. What he found inside that cave was not a lost goat. What he found was a collection of ancient scrolls sealed in clay jars, preserved by the extreme dryness of the Judean desert, untouched for roughly 2,000 years. The discovery is now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. It is considered one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. The Israel Antiquities Authority holds and catalogues the manuscripts, and their records are publicly accessible. Among the manuscripts catalogued from the site at Qumran is the document designated 4Q201, which scholars identify as an Aramaic copy of the Book of Enoch. It is not the only Enoch fragment found at Qumran. Multiple fragments of Enochic material were recovered across different caves, indicating that the Book of Enoch was not a rare, obscure, or marginal text among the Jewish community living at Qumran in the centuries surrounding the birth of Jesus. It was present, it was copied, it was read. The community at Qumran was deeply serious about scripture. These were not casual readers. These were men who had withdrawn from ordinary society specifically to pursue rigorous spiritual life and textual study. The presence of Enoch in their library tells the careful reader something important. It tells the reader that in the world Jesus was born into, the traditions surrounding Genesis 6, the Watchers, the Nephilim, the ancient cosmic conflict, were not fringe mythology. They were part of the serious spiritual conversation of first-century Judaism. This is not a conspiracy, this is archaeology. And this is the exact reason why what the New Testament does next is so difficult for many modern readers to process.
In a lot of ways, because it's history.
Well, the institution, it was instituted by Christ, but that doesn't mean that it can't be flawed. And there's a school of thought that says it isn't what it purports to be.
Because the Book of Enoch did not stay in the Old Testament world, it did not stay in the desert caves at Qumran, it did not stay in the Ethiopian mountains, it found its way into the New Testament itself, not through implication, not through vague thematic similarity. Through a direct quotation. One of the writers of the New Testament, in a letter that sits inside every Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox Bible printed today, reached back into the Enochic tradition and quoted it, by name, as prophecy. And most believers sitting in churches every Sunday have never once been shown that verse. The letter of Jude is one of the shortest documents in the entire New Testament. Most people read past it in minutes. 25 verses, easy to overlook, easy to file under minor epistle and move forward toward Revelation. That is a mistake. Because buried inside those 25 verses is a moment that should stop every serious Bible reader completely. Jude 14 and 15 record the following. Jude writes that Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about certain ungodly people, saying that the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment on all, and to convict the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness. Jude does not say a tradition claims. He does not say some ancient writers believed. He names Enoch directly. He calls him the seventh from Adam. He quotes the prophecy as a living warning aimed at people in his own time. That is a New Testament writer, in a letter that sits inside every Bible printed today, reaching directly into Enochic tradition and treating it as prophetic authority. Scholars have examined this connection carefully. The passage Jude quotes corresponds closely to material found in 1 Enoch chapter 1, verses 9 through the surrounding context. Dr. Richard Borkham, a scholar of New Testament studies, has written extensively on the letter of Jude and identified the connection between Jude's quotation and 1 Enoch as a direct and intentional literary reference, not a casual parallel. The text of 1 Enoch chapter 1 verse 9 in the Ethiopic tradition and the Greek fragments recovered from Qumran match the substance of what Jude records. This does not automatically resolve every debate about Enoch's canonical status. Scholars continue to discuss what Jude's quotation means for how the text should be classified, but it does settle one question permanently. The world of the New Testament knew Enoch. The early followers of Jesus knew Enoch. The writers who produced the letters that became Christian scripture knew Enoch. They did not consider it a dangerous fringe document. They quoted it as prophecy in a letter warning believers about spiritual deception. And the question that now sits in the room, the question that does not go away once it is asked, is this. If a New Testament writer in the 1st century quoted Enoch as a living warning about ungodly people, about judgment, about the coming of the Lord with his holy ones, then why did so many generations of believers after him lose the thread entirely? Why did the church remember Jude, but forget what Jude was pointing at? That answer requires looking directly at the words of Jesus himself. Jesus said it plainly, no allegory, no parable wrapping around it to soften the edges. Matthew 24:4 records that when his disciples came to him privately and asked about the signs of his coming and the end of the age, the very first thing Jesus said was this, "Take heed that no man deceive you." That was his opening word on the subject. Not comfort, not a calendar, not a sequence of events to watch for from a safe distance. The first word was a warning about deception. The first concern was not outside destruction, it was internal blindness. Then in Matthew 24:37, Jesus made a comparison that should permanently change the way any serious reader understands the flood narrative in Genesis. He said, "As the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. He was not using Noah as a vague metaphor for bad times. He was making a specific structural parallel. He was saying that the conditions that existed before the flood will reappear before his return. He was pointing his disciples directly back at Genesis 6. Luke 17:26 through 30 fills out the picture further. Jesus describes people eating and drinking, marrying and being given in marriage, right up until the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. He extends the parallel to Lot, to Sodom, to the day fire fell. He is not describing a world that looked obviously corrupt from the outside. He is describing a world that looked completely normal to the people living inside it. That is the detail that most modern readings rush past. Jesus did not say the danger would arrive looking dangerous. He said it would arrive looking ordinary. People eating, people marrying, people conducting the daily business of being alive, not panicking, not aware, not watching, just living inside a world that had quietly moved so far from its foundation that judgment was already on its way, and the population had no frame of reference left to recognize it. Ephesians 6:12 records that the struggle believers face is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual forces in the heavenly places. The language Paul uses is structural, organized, hierarchical.
2 hours long. Now, you've got another film coming up, I hear, but it probably haven't started yet, called The Resurrection. It's a sequel to The Passion of the Christ. Is that true?
It's probably about 3 years off because it's a big subject.
Yeah, I've read the book.
Yeah.
This is not a vague reference to bad attitudes or personal temptation. This is a description of arranged spiritual opposition that operates at a level most daily life never stops to consider. And 1 Peter 3:18 through 20 records that after his death, Christ went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, those who were disobedient long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah. The days of Noah did not end with the flood. They echoed forward, all the way into the New Testament, all the way into the warnings of Jesus, and according to Jesus himself, all the way into the world that is coming next. There is a specific kind of pain that comes when a person realizes the story they were given was smaller than the story that actually existed. It is not the pain of losing faith. It is something more complicated than that. It is the pain of realizing that the faith was real, that the foundation was solid, but that somewhere between the ancient world and the modern pew, certain rooms in the house were quietly closed off. No announcement, no explanation, just doors that stayed shut long enough that eventually most people stopped noticing they were there. Many believers who have discovered the Ethiopian Bible, the Book of Enoch, the Qumran manuscripts, and the Jude connection describe a very similar emotional sequence. First, shock, then a burning need to understand why this was never explained. Then, in some cases, a grief that is hard to articulate to anyone who has not experienced it. The grief is not about the texts themselves. The grief is about the distance it creates between the believer and the version of the story they were raised inside of. That grief is valid, but it deserves to be examined carefully because the larger story does not weaken the foundation. It expands it. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is not smaller because the world he entered was more complex than a simplified Sunday school lesson conveyed. It is larger. It is more costly. It means more, not less, when the full weight of what he was walking into is understood. 1 Corinthians 15:55 records Paul's declaration, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" That declaration was not made in a simple world. It was made in the world of Genesis 6, in the world Enoch described, in the world where principalities and powers were real enough that Paul named them in Ephesians 6 as organized opposition. The resurrection was not a quiet, happy ending to a simple story. It was a decisive victory inside a war that had been running since before human civilization began. The believer who feels shaken by the depth of the ancient record is not losing ground. They are standing on more ground than they realized they had. And the question now is not whether the mystery destroys faith. The question is whether a faith that has never faced the mystery is strong enough for what the world is currently becoming. Because the world right now is showing something that the ancient warnings mapped in detail. Pick up a phone, open any app, scroll for 60 seconds. In that 60 seconds, a person in the United States in 2024 can encounter a celebrity pastor promoting a book, a viral clip redefining ancient scripture with no historical grounding, an influencer building a personal spiritual brand with millions of followers, 3 competing theories about the Book of Revelation presented as certainty, and an algorithm that has already calculated exactly which version of truth that specific person is most likely to accept and keep watching. This is the information environment that modern believers are trying to build discernment inside of. Jesus said in Matthew 24:5 that many will come in his name, saying they are the Christ, or that they speak for him and will deceive many, not a few, many. The Greek word used there is pol. It means a large number, a crowd. Jesus was not warning about one obvious false teacher who would be easy to identify. He was warning about volume, about saturation, about a world so full of competing spiritual voices that the act of discernment itself would become exhausting. That is not a description of the ancient world only. That is a description of Tuesday morning in America. The ancient parallel runs precise. The world before the flood was not a world without religious activity. Enochic tradition describes a world that had received forbidden knowledge, that had developed systems of power, that had built structures of culture and civilization, and that had done all of it while moving steadily away from the source. The people in that world were not sitting in obvious darkness. They were sitting in the middle of everything that looked like progress. And they were not watching. Ephesians 5:14 records the ancient call, "Awake, you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light." That verse was written to people who were already believers, already inside the community of faith.
Let's see, for all of us to take that event and the extent of the sacrifice, take it for granted. And I just wanted to put that on film to give people maybe a new look and to sort of bring another theological perspective to it that perhaps they hadn't.
The warning was not directed at the openly hostile world outside. It was directed at people who had become spiritually numb inside a world that had normalized the very conditions the ancient warnings described. The tragedy of the present moment is not that the warnings are gone. They are still in the text, still in Jude, still in Matthew 24, still in Genesis 6, still preserved in Ethiopian manuscripts that monks copied by hand for 15 centuries. The tragedy is that the warnings are available and the attention is elsewhere. A world drowning in information, but starving for the one thing that makes information meaningful: discernment. And that brings everything, Gibson, Rogan, Ethiopia, Enoch, Genesis, Jude, Jesus, back to one final question. The warning was never hidden. Read that again slowly, because it matters more than almost anything else this documentary has covered. The Book of Enoch was not buried by a secret council in a hidden vault beneath a cathedral. It was preserved in Ethiopia, in plain sight, by a Christian church that has existed without interruption for over 1,500 years. The Qumran community was reading it 2,000 years ago in the desert outside Jerusalem. Jude quoted it in the New Testament. Jesus pointed back to the world it described and said, "That world is coming back. Pay attention." None of that was hidden. What changed was not the availability of the warning. What changed was the depth of attention people were willing to bring to it. Mel Gibson sat across from Joe Rogan and described a resurrection story that reaches from the fall of angels to the death of the last apostle. Millions of people watched that conversation. Many of them had never heard of the Book of Enoch before that moment. Many of them had never asked why the Ethiopian Bible contains 88 books, while the Protestant Bible contains 66. Many of them had never sat with Matthew 24:37 long enough to feel the full weight of what Jesus was saying when he pointed back to the days of Noah. It took a Hollywood filmmaker on a podcast to make millions of people ask questions that have been sitting in ancient scripture for 2,000 years. That is not a criticism of Gibson or Rogan. It is a mirror. The ancient warning was not primarily about giants or floods or fallen angels. Those were the symptoms. The warning was about a condition of the human heart that produces the same pattern across time. A world that gets so full of noise, so saturated with competing voices, so comfortable inside its own distraction, that it stops recognizing what it has lost. The question Jesus left open was never only about the end of the world. It was about this moment, right now, the moment a person decides whether the ancient record deserves their full attention or just another few seconds of scroll time. If this documentary opens something in you that you have never fully examined before, do not close it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because the ancient texts, the forgotten traditions, and the questions about humanity's spiritual origins that have been buried or misunderstood go far deeper than one documentary can carry. The Nephilim, the giants, the visions of Enoch, the archaeology that keeps surfacing evidence the mainstream conversation is not ready for. That is what this channel exists to uncover. And the next story will take you somewhere most people have never been asked to look. Share this with someone who is ready to ask the hard questions. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice in this conversation matters, and it may be exactly what someone else needed to hear today. The warning was never hidden. The only question left is whether anyone is still listening.